I just cannot tell you how much I enjoyed this conversation with Andrea Smith. She is warm, wise, and full of lessons that I am sure are going to resonate with you. Andrea's story is one of love, resilience, and transformation. She opens up about the challenges of parenting through a major crisis, how she and her husband navigated the strain that this put on their relationship, and most importantly, how they managed to find their way back to each other stronger than ever. As you listen, I want you to pay attention to these three things. 1, the moment where Andrea realized that she was carrying the load of all of this crisis alone, and what changed when she allowed herself to lean on others. Number 2, the simple yet powerful way that she and her husband reconnected after being years in survival mode. And number 3, pay attention to her mindset, her philosophy about things, because it really made a difference in how she was able to deal with the situation and not just hope, but be convinced that things were going to get better, helping her get through the difficulties with strength and grace. You'll find that this conversation is rich with lessons, whether you're in the thick of parenting challenges or you're looking to reconnect in your relationship. And because there is so much to unpack, I will be continuing this discussion in my newsletter this week. So you might notice at the end of this episode that there is no outro that I usually do in interviews where I do a deeper analysis of what was discussed and how it was helpful and what nuggets we can keep from it. This episode is so full of information that I don't want to make it any longer than it has to be. So this deeper analysis, along with a journaling exercise, if you wish, is going to be in my newsletter. So if you haven't signed up already, make sure that you go to markelakaplani.com/newsletter and get yourself signed up. The link is in the show notes. Now, before we get started, let me tell you a little bit more about Andrea. Andrea Smith is a passionate advocate for mental health and personal growth, blending her experiences as mother, storyteller, and entrepreneur to inspire others. After 18 years in the corporate sector, and more specifically in sales, she stepped away in order to take care of her family, and more specifically, her children's mental health. Now, with her children thriving as adults, Andrea has channeled her journey into This Way Up, a podcast dedicated to supporting parents and caregivers who are facing similar challenges. She is also the co-founder of Car Oracle, a woman-owned business revolutionizing the car buying process with expert guidance and personalized support. With her empathetic support and her commitment to uplifting others, Andrea creates spaces where people can find resources, resilience, and hope. You can find out more about Andrea and ways to connect with her in the show notes. All right, so let's dive into this incredible episode with Andrea Smith. Hi there. If this is your first time here, welcome to the Parenthood and Relationship Podcast. I'm your host, Markela Kaplani, a psychologist, a parenthood and relationship coach, and a parent myself. Together, we explore the transformative journey of parenthood and its profound impact on our relationship with ourselves, our partners, and our children, so that we can be present and show up as we envision without having to do more. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome, Andrea, to the Parenthood and Relationship Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Markella. I'm excited to be here.
It's an honor to have you, and there's a lot that you can share with us. Before we hit record, we were discussing a few of these things, and I would like for you to take the mic and introduce yourself to everyone.
Okay, thank you. And if this gets a little long, feel free to interrupt me. I'm okay. So before having children, I had this very idealistic view of what my life was going to be like. I was going to be a working, successful mom that had kids, that everything was just going to run smoothly. They were going to graduate college, and I was going to end up on a porch with my husband on a rocking chair, reminiscing about life. What I quickly realized is life takes turns that you don't expect. I'm going to fast forward through the young years. I was working when my kids were young and very, very successful. And when my son turned 11, he ended up getting strep throat, right? Every child gets strep throat at some point. What every child doesn't get is that that virus crossed over his blood-brain barrier and overnight lit a debilitating case of OCD. So one day, my son was, a fully functioning 11-year-old boy playing soccer, reading books, having friends, laughing. And then within a month, he was to the point where he couldn't function throughout the day without severe anxiety and all of these thoughts that come along with obsessive compulsive disorder. And that was terrifying. It was terrifying. We didn't know what was going on with him. We thought at the time, we didn't realize he had pandas. We had thought that he had a brain tumor or this, that, and the other. Quickly came to realize that it was OCD. At the time, the disorder that is now called pandas didn't really exist in the medical community. Even today, it's a little bit touchy, but it's more known. So we were kind of at a loss. And what were we going to do? I knew that we needed to stop the trajectory that it was going on because his behaviors were changing so quickly with the disorder. So instead of getting him into a hospital and having him leave my home, I decided to take on his care full time with the help of therapists and psychiatrists and psychologists. But I did it at home most of the time. I was no longer working. My husband took over providing for the family. He was traveling a lot, and his job was to keep the finances coming and keep that insurance. We needed health insurance. I also had an 8-year-old daughter at the time who her brother was her everything, and I was her second everything. And all of a sudden, we weren't there for her during this period of time because we were so focused on trying to get him stabilized. I basically outsourced her care. Not really, but I would ask the neighbor across the street to take her to her dance lessons or her drama lessons. I would ask the neighbor across the street to feed her dinner if things were very chaotic at home. Life made it so that she couldn't be a priority for that period of time. It took about 8 months to stabilize my son. He still has OCD, but it's all under control. But we needed to stabilize it. We needed to stop that trajectory that it was on. Once that stopped, I then said, we need to focus on the damage that has been done to my daughter. There's abandonment issues, right? And there, anxiety, all these things that couldn't really be focused on. So I started to get her some help. And of course, she had anxiety and now has depression as well. And once we took her through about a year of just therapy for her anxiety, and that didn't work. It just had gotten too bad. And so we started to put her on medication and quickly realized that medication for her was going to be much more difficult. She got on medication and she started having all sorts of side effects. She would not sleep for days, or she would get severely focused on things, almost like she was OCD. And so, where we were able to stabilize my son, and he may have had bumps along the way, she, for many years, really struggled with very intense anxiety to the point where when she was in 7th grade, she went to school for 9 days in a semester because we could not get her to go to school. Now, fast forward through all of this. Both of my kids are thriving. They are leading very typical lives, happy lives, and are both in college. One's about ready to graduate college, and one is in her second year. My husband and I, through all of that, through thick and thin, and we'll get a little deeper into that, we have also thrived. And now we are at that point in our marriage where honestly, I feel like we were before we had kids. We are, back to loving and appreciating one another for who we are as individuals.
Hmm. It's very nice to have you here today because you are sharing a very unique story and you're sharing it so openly. I think it shows a lot about how we can go through so many things in the parenthood journey. And for you, this was a very terrifying thing to go through, right?
Yeah.
As a mother, as a parent, to not know what's happening. So, first of all, this is a very rough journey that you had to go through. And this is part of matrescence as well, in the way that you had to adjust to so many different levels, not just developmentally as your children were changing, but also in very unique circumstances where you had to keep on switching gears
Mhm.
and had to decide who to focus on and how to do it, and had to take matters into your own hands in order to deal with a situation and having that responsibility on your shoulders. And so I want to first go back a little bit to that stage of your son's life.
Okay.
And I wonder how it was for you to be going through that fear and to have that responsibility. What was that part of your matrescence journey like?
So devastating. That wraps it up. Devastating and terrifying. When things were happening so quickly to him and there was a lot of uncertainty around it, um, gosh, even after we knew what was going on with him, it was still terrifying because he was such a different person for a period of time. And I wasn't sure whether I was going to get my sweet little boy back. Because it happened so quickly, there was this, I think, very relevant fear that he was gone and he was lost forever. But I realized through hard work and the help of professionals that we were able to get him back. But at that time, I was also feeling very, very hopeless and alone. And part of that feeling alone, looking back, was because I did that to myself. I didn't allow other people to help support me during that time. I leaned on my mom heavily, but like I said, my husband, his job was the one that was supporting us financially so that we had insurance. And I didn't want to bother him with what was going on at home. I didn't want to stress him out. So I became the caregiver. And then I became the only one, the holder of all of the information, right? I knew how to do everything. And I wasn't going to share that with him, not because I didn't want him to know. I just didn't feel like I was like, I'm not going to be a burden. But what did that end up doing? I put this huge divide in between the two of us because now I looked at him as not competent to be able to provide care for my son, which is a horrible thing now looking back at it. I'm like, gosh, yeah, that was awful to do to both of us. But at the time it was survival, right? It was like, okay, I'm going to just compartmentalize. I want to protect him from all of these feelings that I'm feeling. I want to protect my son from everything at that point, and I'm just going to take the reins and move forward with what I've got here.
Yeah, exactly. Survival mode. And that is why you did it. You were trying to survive. And a lot of times it feels like I can be quicker and I can be more efficient if I'm doing it alone. But like you very beautifully described, that cannot exist in a vacuum. We are going to then build up resentment and start to feel like, okay, well, I took it upon myself, but where were you? Are you not competent enough? And at the same time, we see that there's this blame, but it's important that you do trace it back and say, at that moment in time, it was survival.
Mhm.
Because you're looking at it now from the point of view where you are now, and it seems like, oh my God, that was awful that I did this.
Mhm.
But at that point, it's what you needed to do.
Yeah.
And it's important not to regret it, but to be able to grow from it. The only way that we grow from something is to be able to look back, realize what went wrong with that, what wasn't the best approach, but to be able to say, but that's okay, to have the compassion to say, in that moment, I needed to do that. It worked in this way, but it doesn't serve me if I continue it now. And here's what I can do. Whereas if you were stuck in a form of self-deprecation or
Right.
self-punishment to say, oh, how awful was it that I did that to myself and I did that to my husband and I treated him this way, then that builds the guilt and shame that I cannot face then my husband so that we can fix it together. And then I just continue the same cycle. So it sounds like you were able to give yourself, first and foremost, that compassion for that time in your journey where you did feel terrified and hopeless and alone. And then that also helped the marriage, even though my understanding is that it did face some bumps in the road.
Oh yeah. I mean, what marriage doesn't? But interestingly enough that you say that. So my husband and I now have conversations about looking back, what we would have done differently and like what can we impart on others that maybe would be going through a similar journey. So my husband's take on all of that on that period of time was that he was absent and that he was the one that wasn't being engaged. And he came to me a few months ago, well, it's probably been a year ago now, and said, if I could tell any fathers out there, he says, and I'm going to say fathers because I think it's typically men who do this. He said, I would say get involved in the care of your child right away and insist that you stay with that. He said, I disengaged. So at the same time that I was putting up walls and boundaries around the care of my son, he was also disengaging and allowing me to do that. And so we both realized that we played a part in that. And
Mm.
it turned out okay, but it probably wasn't in the best interest for anybody there. I mean, it's just kind of that snowball effect, right? He wasn't involved from the beginning. So then he didn't understand what was happening. He wasn't emotionally connected in the same way that I was. And so he came from a very different view of how we needed to work on treatment and those kind of things. Whereas if we both would have opened up with a conversation early on, we probably would have been able to tackle it together and maybe avoided a few of those bumps that you have through marriage.
Yes, but what you're describing is quite normal in terms of dynamic. If a couple wants to stay together, and in this case, we can't know who started it, right?
Right.
What came first, the chicken or the egg? Let's assume that you started to take control of the situation, being as terrified as you were, that you started to close up and start to feel like, I need to take care of this. And you didn't do it consciously. You
No.
probably just really heavily focused so much on taking care of your son that you really didn't have any other capacity to turn around and say, hey, do you want to be involved? It just felt safer to compartmentalize and just look at that one thing in that moment. But if you are doing this and you're pulling to the right, then if I want to stay with you, I have to also not pull the other way. I have to follow along. And so it's not to blame you for doing it, but we have to kind of dance together. And if you're going right, I have to kind of follow along a
Sure.
little bit at the very least in order to not strain the relationship. At the same time, when he started to disengage, it obviously, at the very least subconsciously, made you feel like I have to engage even further. And so
Right.
this is how patterns continue to occur. And we think it's because he or she doesn't care enough, but it is because we are pulling one way and they have to follow along. And it's because they care that they're following our lead because they want to dance with us for as long as they have to until we go back to some kind of equilibrium.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point.
And so, when do you believe in that trajectory that you described? When do you believe that you got to the point where you were able to reflect back on all of this and have this assessment in the way
Mm.
that you did?
It took years. I'll be honest, it took years. So my son's situation was very intense for a very short period of time. And then like I said, it would spike up throughout his teen years. Um, and then my daughter's just seemed like it was 4 or 5 years long. It just kept going.
Mhm.
Throughout that time, we're obviously getting the kids therapy along with the medical attention that they needed. And then at one point, I convinced my husband to come along to the therapy sessions, and we started to do family therapy, really. And we would all talk about things. And we did that for a period of time. And then my husband and I did some therapy together. It was more individualized therapy, but we did therapy together. But it wasn't until, honestly, that COVID came and we had to spend more time together that we realized that we loved one another and we became more vulnerable because we were forced to make the time for one another, which I know for a lot of people, having that time is scary and it was disruptive to their marriage. For us, we were able to reconnect and we were able to be vulnerable at that point. And so it's really been the last 5 years that he and I have had very open conversations. And then when my daughter was going to graduate from high school, I was thinking about what my next step was. What is life for me? I was feeling very vulnerable at the time, feeling like, well, what's my relevance? I've had this intense position of motherhood for these kids these last 10 years. And now I am moving into where they're doing great. I got myself fired from that job. I realize now that I didn't. They still need me. They still call me every day, but that's a whole different story. But then I started to consider, what can I do? And I had figured that I had this, I'd been given these experiences to help other people. So I started my own podcast, and that opened up the door for us to have conversations about what happened during that time. And we have had intense conversations a lot. I mean, we probably have them once or twice a week, even now, about what happened then. How have we grown? What would we do differently? And there is no blame. I mean, I think just naturally, we just didn't blame each other for anything. We were able to look at it as it is what it is. And it was a huge opportunity for growth for us as a family, for us as a couple, and for us individually. It gave us the opportunity to learn more about life itself.
Hmm. But where you see growth, a lot of couples will see opportunity to see differences, to see carelessness.
Mhm.
And I wonder where it is that you got this kind of mindset. Was it the therapy that you were doing? Was it something else? Because I talk about it a lot on
Yeah.
this podcast, how motherhood and fatherhood and difficult experiences like the one that you described, which really did put you in a position of having to be so devoted and so focused on your motherhood identity. These kinds of experiences can break us, and they can be used even as excuses sometimes
Yeah.
to lose ourselves or lose touch with reality or lose our relationship with our partner. But you managed to turn it around and use it as a form of growth and development, which is what I talk about. So this is very inspiring to hear. And I would like to know, where do you attribute this very healthy and functional mindset?
Well, I want to first say that there are times when it is not growth. There is times when I feel, I feel frustrated, and there were times when I felt defeated and I felt resentful. Absolutely. I went through all of those real emotions. I absolutely did. And then on top of that, I hate to say that there wasn't really a defining moment. I think it's how we lived life. When my husband and I first got married, we bought a stuffed
Wow.
crab,
Okay.
and not a real crab, a
Oh,
stuffed crab, a stuffed crab. And when we would get upset at one another, or we were being tense or whatever, we would throw the crab at one another, because we were being crabby. And so we had, kind of started our relationship off with this playfulness about certain situations. I remember when we were dating, my husband had said that he never wants to take us for granted. Now, I remember that. I also remember probably 15 years of each of us taking each other for granted. But now coming out of it and looking back and saying, I'm not taking you for granted. So there's part of it, I think, that's just instilled in us as who we are, that we're fighters, and that we were very committed to the family and the relationship, that we just got through it. And then as we got through it, and I wouldn't say that we were very healthy. We were not the poster children for how to get through something, because it was tough. You just learn. But I think that as life quieted down and we started to peel back the layers and started to find out and try to look at it, how did this benefit us? Because if we didn't look at it that way, it would destroy us. I guess that's what it was. Is we
mm.
For us, it was either this is going to destroy us, or we're going to make it through and we're going to see the good out of it. And for me, I'd much rather see the good out of it. It's a lot easier than going through all of the tumultuous feelings of destruction.
You're sharing a lot of great advice. I absolutely love the thing about the crab. My husband quite recently saw this thing on Instagram where someone was suggesting that every time you feel like your partner is saying something that may be either annoying or they may be nagging or something like that, or that you're having some kind of a disagreement, just go ahead and kiss them while they're talking.
Mhm.
And while I was like, oh, but that may signal some form of dismissiveness, I'm not
Right.
sure.
Yeah.
He actually did it with me, and there was no way that I could not laugh at what he had just done.
Yeah.
And it really was a way to throw me and himself in that moment out of the seriousness of the topic and just laugh
Yeah.
and bring that playfulness. So I love the thing with the crab because it does the same thing. It makes us become a little bit more playful. It snaps us out of what we're expecting. And the way that that works is a technique I've never shared on the podcast before. So thank you for doing that, for giving me the opportunity as well, and giving the listeners the opportunity to hear how this kind of thing helps, because we think this is a very serious matter and I would be doing a disservice if I did something like that. But that playfulness is something that we need in those serious moments, and it doesn't take away from what we're trying to express, but it's a reminder of, hey, we're in this together and we'll figure it out. We can do it from a different point of view.
Yeah.
But I also really like what you say about the way that you question, how can we grow from this? Because we don't have to do something negative. If we just allow things to be, our mind is wired to focus on the negative. So if you just allowed the situation to continue unfolding in the way that it was, then it could have really taken a heavy toll on the relationship. Whereas at some point, you started to question, how did we grow from this? How did the children grow from this? How did I grow from it? How did we grow from it as a couple? And that takes conscious effort. It takes intention to ask that question and to look for that positive, that silver lining, which can truly save a situation. I like how vulnerably you share that. Of course, you weren't the poster children. My question wasn't suggesting that you guys were supposed to
I know.
always have it together, right? Because no, a lot of people do believe that if we are a healthy couple, then these difficult moments aren't supposed to shake us. Well, of course, they're going to shake you. We're all human and we feel human emotions. And I like how you say, yes, it shook us, but we intentionally looked at it from a growth mindset.
You know, before we were recording, you were talking about how you can't depend on love. And I always loved my husband, still do, but love wasn't enough. It wouldn't have gotten us through that. I still loved him through all of that, but it took a lot of work. It took intentional work to say, okay, I'm sticking through this, or okay, we're going to make it. Because I mean, quite frankly, it was like, I don't want to over dramatize it, but it's somewhat like a war zone in there. It was like we had to, just put on our boots and walk through that for a while and make the conscious decision that we weren't leaving each other as much as we wanted to at times.
What kept you in that stage? What helped you endure, even though at some points you felt like, yes, leaving each other is a potential option?
So first of all, I'm going to say I'm a Taurus, so I'm notoriously supposed to be stubborn. So maybe that had something to do with it. But I actually think that that both of us would weigh the options of, okay, what would this do to our kids? And we didn't necessarily have these conversations together at all times, but I know both of us thought this at the time, like, okay, if we break this family unit up, it can be very detrimental. Is it worth breaking up? Because there's going to be issues with whoever, right? And so I think that we knew who each other was before we had kids and before we had intense pressure, and we were committed to that. And then there was this, maybe it was a hope that that would come back. And it never did come back, but it's better because we grew through that time. But that love stuck with us as long as we were continuing to work through it. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Yes. Yes, very much so. I wonder because a lot of us, and me included for a long period of time, have a resistance to the fact that we're changing and we want to come back to how it was with ourselves and with our partner, to the relationship we used to have. And a lot of times we hope so much for coming back to the relationship as it used to be that we hold off, and we hold off by pressing pause in a way and just expecting that when things die down, when the kids are older, then things can go back to the way that we used to be. And it sounds like you guys didn't necessarily do it. Maybe you were hoping that at some points, but it sounds like you found a way to expect, in a sense. I wonder how it worked for you to expect that things were going to be different. Was it the fact that you were going through such a hard time, through such a unique hardship that kind of knocked you out of resistance? Or was it something else that made you a little bit more accepting of the fact that there is no going back to normal?
I think it was probably the hardship. I think that it was so sudden and so intense that it just jarred us. It jarred us, and there wasn't any going back. But interestingly enough, we're back probably more to where we were, not only as a couple, but even as a family than we've ever been. I mean, we went through this tumultuous time and then we kind of stabilized again. Yeah. It was a little different. Things are a little different, but we all grew as a family and we were just as committed to each other as we were when we were a family of young children with other type of issues, whether or not we're getting to the soccer game late or whatever. It's just that those issues were a little bit bigger. But I think it's definitely the situation made it very apparent that we were all going to be different people from that.
Mm. So when you're talking about going back, you are talking about a general state of being a more of an emotional state rather
Mhm.
than who you are. Because you're saying you've grown and you're different people, but at the same time you're saying we have gone back, we've achieved to go back. And so for our listeners, I want to clarify, what is this going back?
Yeah. Okay. That's a good point. We're different people, but the unity that we had prior to that event is the same. We all grew at different times and at different levels, but we've kind of ended up in the same place. It's just some of us took a little longer than others to get to that point of stability, I would say. I guess that's probably the biggest thing is now we're stable as a family. Yeah, we're going to have bumps here and there, but we're stable. But communication allowed us to recognize and appreciate the changes that we all went through so that we can have that stability as a unit. Does that make sense?
A lot, and I find it very interesting. It's not something that I've necessarily considered before, to be honest, that this going back, a lot of times we think that we want to go back to an old self in terms of identity and we think in terms of traits. But what you are talking about and the peace in your voice when you say we went back, it is signaling something else. It's signaling stability and unity. So it's something to consider that when we want to go back, we are wanting to go back to the safety of being stable and of being united. And if we reframe it in that way, that going back doesn't mean that I have to be that same exact person that I used to be. Going back, that need that keeps on rising up inside of me and it keeps on making me resist and it makes me feel agitated and anxious to do something different. That's not me really wanting to be that person who I used to be, but that's me wanting to establish a new sense of stability and unity. So thank you for that. That's very interesting.
And honestly, Markella, I don't want to go back to being that person I was. I appreciate her for who she was in that period of her time, but that person was still living this very hectic life where she wasn't being true to herself. I'll tell you a little story. I've told several times, but I had a mother come up to me on the soccer field when my son was maybe 10, and I was the teen mom. I was super successful in my job. My kids were always put together. I was always put together. We made it to practice on time, all of this stuff, right? And she was going to have to go back to work. She was a stay-at-home mom and she came up to me. She says, "I just don't know how you do it. How do you do it?" And I said, "Do you know that junk closet you have at home? I said, the one that when guests are coming over, you're shoving all of the stuff in it, and then you kind of push the door shut as close and maybe lock it. I said, and then when that guest leaves, you unlock it and open it, and all the stuff falls out. I said, that's me. I said, on the outside, I'm that pretty door. I said, but once you open up and take off this beautiful white suit or whatever, I said, all my shit's falling out. So back then, I wasn't living authentically. I was living this life of who I was supposed to be. That mom that could handle everything, that wife that could handle everything, that employee that could handle everything. And then guess what? Something came along that I couldn't handle, and I couldn't manage it anymore. And life fell apart, and I fell apart. And in some ways, looking back, I'm happy I fell apart. I'm so happy to be relieved of that pressure that I was putting on myself of who I needed to be. So I think that, you know, I say going back, I don't want to be that person. I loved her for who she was, and I loved her for who she turned into. And I don't want my husband to go back. I talk about myself being a mess. He was a mess too, in his own way. And now I look at him and he is such a better person. He's such an amazing person. But it's because we went through all of that that allowed us to see who we really are and to shed all of that pretentious personalities that we thought we had to be.
Right. But maybe it wasn't pretension. Maybe it was a survival mechanism. These things all start from somewhere. So if you had to be that person that never gets tired and can handle everything,
Yeah.
maybe it's because at some point this served you.
Yeah.
So it's important not to judge that self as well, because if it was there for a reason. And it was a mechanism that somehow was serving you at that point in time. And then came this hardship that in a way helped you fall apart and see this is also something that can help you grow. And it is okay and you are still worthy or worthwhile, even if you don't handle everything and even if you relinquish some control. And for me, I think I didn't have such a big event happen, thankfully. I'm very grateful for that. But at the same time, for me, it was the sleepless nights, that extreme sleep deprivation of where my son would wake up 4 or 5 times a night and stay awake 1.5 hours each time, which meant I rarely slept. If I slept half-hour increments that led to 4 hours of sleep, I felt like I was a queen.
Yeah.
And so for me, that sleep deprivation was something that I had never experienced. And I'm a person that needs my sleep, apparently. And it really broke me. I couldn't function at all as the person that I used to function. I was very, very tied to that image of myself of never tired, always a go-getter, achieving all these things, adding on more tasks and tackling all of them. And there I found myself very distraught and very broken by the exhaustion, not thinking straight, not recognizing some of my thoughts and my feelings as stuff that I ever would experience. And this was an opportunity as well for me to grow and find that you don't have to be that all the time. And you can be enough even if you're not always running around and tending to things and doing things that get you the applause and the clap. Like you said, that white suit that makes you look like you're so composed and do all the things.
Yeah. And I think, and I'll say it even for men, but women especially, there is this belief that we have to have it all together at all times. And it's interesting because we talk about it with one another, but it's a lot of times we're putting that on ourselves that we have to be that person. And what I think I realized was that when I allowed myself to show the people around me that I was not put together for a period of time or that I needed them, that it allowed me to have closer relationships, quite frankly. And it took so much of that burden off that I was trying to pretend that even when my son first got sick, nobody knew. Nobody knew anything. I didn't tell anybody anything. And it wasn't until after he stabilized and then I was going through stuff with my daughter, I had met a woman who we started a business together and she had to see it. She had to see what was going on because we were business partners. And we started talking. And from that point on, I really recognized the need for friendships, for vulnerability, and to allow myself to show myself in a more authentic way than I had before.
Mm. And is that where that belief that you were going to bother? I wrote it down as you were saying it before. I didn't want to bother. And you were referring to your husband, and I didn't want to be a burden. Is that where it started to kind of unravel?
Yeah, I think so. That was probably that journey or that moment that took that piece of where I was that I wasn't a burden, but that's a hard thing, I mean, that whole being a burden to somebody else and somebody's got it worse than I do or somebody's, it's so complex and I try to share the message that just because somebody has it worse than you do doesn't mean that what you're feeling and what you're going through isn't tough. And I can say that only because I've been through it. I didn't live that way. I used to live that, okay, well, somebody's got it worse than I do. So I might as well just, keep this to myself. But yeah,
Yeah, and keep going and not complain and not ask for support because there's worse situations. And I think we feel a little noble in saying that, oh yeah, I'm humble and I
mhm,
know that there is worse. And at the same time, I think it's also a way that we keep ourselves shielded.
absolutely. Absolutely. Because if we open up to somebody else, then we have to open up to ourselves, right? If I were to have shared, first, I didn't think anybody would understand, but if I would have shared that, then I was also sharing with myself that maybe this piece of my life at this point, I wasn't in full control anymore. And that maybe I would make mistakes, but then I would learn from them eventually. But I mean, I think if I had shared that with somebody, that would have been really telling myself that I couldn't handle it or giving myself that message again, knowing now that I could handle it, but I needed help.
You are referring to a different type of relationship, a type of relationship that I don't talk about too often, the friendship.
Mhm.
And that was something that helped you break down a few of the walls. What was it about the way that your friend and business partner received this information, this opening up, that allowed you to feel like, oh my, this is the benefit I could get, instead of feeling like, oops, I overshared and this is very embarrassing and closing up even worse?
I think this woman is one of my favorite people on this planet, by the way, because she is just so herself. And when I broke down, she just was there and there was no judgment. Now, there were smart ass remarks and things that if you saw it, you probably would have thought, wow, how did she say that? But it was all the intention behind it. You knew that was so genuine and pure. Because I
Mm.
remember her telling me once, she was like, nope, I would just ship everybody off and I would not stay in your family. And, that's pretty harsh, right? It's like, "Oh, is my family that bad?" I could have looked at it that way, right? It could have been, "Oh my god,
Mhm.
my family's that bad. I'm failing." But instead, I realized that it gave me this validity that it was hard, and it was harder than I was allowing myself to actually realize at the time. So I think that lack of judgment, that acceptance from her. And then, quite honestly, when I talk to people now, I get that same acceptance. I'm not sharing with everybody. I don't want to share with everybody, but most people are very accepting when you're going through issues. They're going to talk as long as you're not complaining, right? And realizing that it's that that shit happens and it's tough. And most people are there for you. But I didn't realize that until she came around and showed me that she's just not judgmental.
Right. And how important it is to have people around us that are this way. And also how important it is that we are also discerning, because sometimes I think what happens is that we feel like we hear a lot about being authentic and sharing our vulnerabilities, but then we don't really screen and we make an attempt with someone who may not be that type of person who will be accepting and non-judgmental. And then it makes things way worse for us.
Yeah.
So there's this very real fear of appearing weak if I share this information, appearing like I'm a complainer, appearing like I could be a bad mother if this happened to me, for example. There's so many fears involved that could get triggered by a person who does not know how to handle such
Yeah.
sensitive information. And it sounds like even though it was a little bit inevitable that you had to share with this person because you were business partners and she would have to know what's going on in order to recognize certain things, I'm
Right.
assuming, about the practical stuff that you had to do in your business. At the same time, you were either lucky or you were very discerning that this is the type of person that I want to work with. And
Right.
this type of person, then I can share this with and will understand. And so it's really important to be able to do that for ourselves and to trust the right person that can unlock us so that we can then be able to really recognize that, yes, of course, it's not weakness if I'm going through a tough time. It's not weakness if I share that, yeah, and currently I'm drowning.
Yeah.
People are going to be much more accepting than judgmental, usually.
You do bring up a good point with the discerning, because I think that I am a very friendly person. I have a lot of people that know me. I have a lot of friends, but there are few that during stressful times that I lean on and that I talk about things with. Now that things are stabilized and it comes more like a story, I can share a lot with other people because it is more like a story. It's not that I'm leaning on them for support. So I think that's a very good point that you said that, I mean, I wouldn't have just shared that with anybody at the time. I didn't. She and the circumstances allowed me to get where I needed to be. And then it still took some time to share. But gosh, once I found that core group of friends, it changed a lot for me. Life changed a lot.
You brought and bring a lot of perspective through what you shared here on the podcast. And I really am so, so grateful to you. If there was one thing that our listeners could walk away with right now, one thing that you would want to share, what would that be?
To not lose hope. I think there was a point in my life where I lost, or I was on the verge of losing hope. That was kind of my guiding light, was that, okay, things will get better. Things will get better. And that hope allowed me to, when things weren't getting better, to say, okay, well, something's not working. So if I want it to get better, I need to look someplace else. I need to make a change here or there. But I always just had this vision that my life was going to be good. And having that hope allowed me to get through so many of the tough times.
Can I change the word?
You
Is that
can.
okay?
You can
I
change
don't
it.
think I don't think it was just hope. I think it was conviction. Because hope sometimes it has this expectation. And if I have hope, I have that expectation that it needs to get better, that it should get better. And as it doesn't, and more time passes, it's very difficult to keep that flame of hope carrying on. But I think along with hope, you had a conviction that it will get better, which then allowed you to not question whether the hope is true or not. You just had to figure out a way to make it happen. So I would say hope along a good dose of conviction that things were going to get better, that they are going to get better for me. And so I need to just be rerouting if things aren't looking like the way I'm hoping they will.
Ooh, that's good, Markella. That is
So I know that people are going to be hungry to listen to you way more, and I want you to definitely share your podcast and any other information that we could get from you and where people can find you.
okay, sure. So my podcast is called This Way Up, and it has an upside down smiley face on it, to show you that life may be in jumbles and you may not know which way is up, but there is always an up and things can get better. And you can find it on wherever you get your podcasts. We're there. You can also find me on Facebook and Instagram at Listen to This Way Up, and TikTok and YouTube at This Way Up Podcast.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for being here with
Oh,
us
it has been a
today.
pleasure. It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Have a beautiful day. Bye.